Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Richard Swinburne. I wanted to invite Professor Swinburne on to talk about two of his popular books to enable those who find this conversation to be enjoyable to go away and hopefully explore both these books and then other more academic papers or books that Professor Swinburne has written. The first one we explored is the very well-known Is There a God? This book looks at the idea of God being the foundational and ultimate explanation for everything. It then moves in to speak about consciousness and souls and what that means for us making decisions and having things like free will. It touches briefly on evolutionary arguments and cosmology and then moves further into the problem of evil. I also wanted to speak to Professor Swinburne today about a new book that he's co-written with somebody called James Sturbar. This is a debate book, so both authors, both Richard and James, write two essays within this book, and it's called Could a Good God Permit So Much Suffering? When I was asking Professor Swinburne to speak to him, he suggested holding on until this book came out to speak with him because it holds some of his most up-to-date argumentation around the idea of the problem of evil. Obviously, again, it's still just a popular book, but it's a really good way to be introduced to some of the things you're going to be hearing about in this conversation today. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with Professor Swinburne. He's so well known and so well respected. It was an absolute delight to be able to get an hour of his time today. And I hope you find this conversation to be an interesting space, and I hope it encourages you to go away, pick up these books and to explore philosophy of religion and what it looks like from a theistic picture. I'm not saying theism's true, but Professor Swinburne is one of the most well-respected theist philosophers that we currently still have with us. So yeah, this was an absolute delight. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button, and then if you select the bell notification icon, if you're watching this on YouTube, that's going to remind you whenever we release a video here. And if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, your family, your followers. As I always say, we grow because you take the time to share our content, so please do share this one far and wide. Okay, enjoy this conversation today with Professor Richard Swinburne. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel. Today I'm joined by Professor Richard Swinburne. Professor Swinburne, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm extremely excited to chat with you today, Professor Swinburne. I've read quite a lot of your work in the past, but I've recently worked my way back through two of your kind of more popular books. One that's a little bit older than the other one now. So the first one being Is There a God? And the second one being a conversation you had with James Sturbar on kind of could a good God permit so much suffering? It's a debate book that's actually only been released in the last month or so, and I found it to be a really interesting kind of deep dive into your work on the problem of evil, essentially. So we're going to be working through some of the content for both of those books, essentially. Before we dive into that, I thought I'd kind of throw a question your way, which I haven't told you about, because I think sometimes these are best answered off the cuff. A lot of people are going to be watching this who are going to think they know you. They're going to think they know the work that you've done. But I'd love to have it from you, Professor Swinburne, kind of what you think or would love to kind of say that your life's work is about. Like, how do you define and identify yourself within the space that you've written?
Well, I'm interested in all the big questions of philosophy, but I'm also always have been a religious person. I believe that there is a God, and I endorse the statements about him in the Christian Creed. What I have tried to do with most of my work is investigate whether there are good arguments in favor of the doctrines of Christianity. And of course, though there is a God, it is hardly special to Christianity. It's the foundation of Christianity, and I devoted a lot of time to arguments for and against that, but I also devoted a significant amount of time to particular Christian doctrines, whether they can be justified, the atonement, the incarnation, the Trinity, and so on. I also devoted a lot of attention to things taken for granted in Christianity, such as whether we consist of body and soul, because only if we have a separable soul does it make sense to suppose that there can be life after death. Because although Christianity is committed to the resurrection, bodily resurrection of the dead, the only way in which I could be resurrected is if some part of me survives death. And since my body can be burned in the crematorium and there won't be any part of me left to be revived, the only way in which I can survive is if my soul does, and that's reunited with another body. So I've devoted quite a lot of attention to the mind-body problem. I'm also very interested in the nature of morality, because Christianity has certain moral claims. It certainly claims that some things are right and some things are wrong, and we are culpable for doing what is wrong. Therefore, I'm interested in whether there are true moral statements and how we can know what they are, though I haven't written a great deal about that. I'm also very interested in free will, but I don't think I can say I've come to a big, startling conclusion about that yet. But I think on balance, the evidence supports that view. So that's been the sort of uh, overriding framework for my work. But of course, many of the topics I've investigated aren't taught in philosophy departments under the heading of philosophy of religion, but under the heading of philosophy of mind or ethics or philosophy of science. And that's why some of my work is just pure philosophy of science or ethics or philosophy of mind. But that has been the overriding drive.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating space to explore. They're some of the biggest things that I love to look at. So yes, first of all, thank you so much for your work in this space. It's incredible. Within is there regards and also kind of some of your more academic works, papers, books, etc. You dive into the idea that something has to be foundational, which I absolutely agree with. And you kind of lay down three different things that could be viewed to be the foundation, kind of one of them being materialism, one of them being humanism, and one of them being theism. I think it'd be really useful to kind of just explore these three very briefly, each in turn. In your book, Is There a God? You kind of put aside humanism very, very quickly, which we can do here as well, if you'd like. But kind of what are these three areas, Professor Swinburne?
Yeah, well, materialism is the view that everything that exists, I was going to say, is material, but physical science allows the existence of, indeed, is central to the existence of some things that they're not material exactly, but they're physical. So I prefer to these days to call it physicalism. Physicalism is the doctrine that everything is physical, and it's the interaction between physical things that makes us is responsible for everything in the world. The difference between the physical and the material, some of the fundamental particles of physics, such as photons, aren't really matter in any sense. But what makes something physical is that it's publicly observable. That is to say, anything that I have a desk in front of me, or that there are photons and pi mesons and so on, is publicly observable in the sense that everyone can find out about it as easily as anyone else given the right apparatus and the right mathematics and so on. Whereas what distinguishes the mental is, my view, that there are events to which the person who experiences them have privileged access. I can know better than anyone else what I am thinking about, because whatever means other people have of finding that out by inspecting my brain and so on, I could use. But of course, go one ahead of that because I could experiencing them. So although the mental and the physical have been defined in various ways by philosophers, those are purely arbitrary definitions. But my point is there are basically two classes of things, substances, two classes of properties, those that to which we have public access and those to which only one person has access. And physicalism is the doctrine that everything is public. That seems to me crazy because we have a mental life. And so the next view, which indeed I dismissed fairly quickly for reasons I'll explain in a moment, is that yes, there are a few certain, as well as all these physical substances, I will call them, as philosophers do, those particular things, physical substances and properties. There are certainly mental properties and, on some views, also mental substances. That is to say, there are events in connected with, of course, caused by, no doubt, and causing, but events to which we have privileged access, our sensations, our thoughts, our intentions, what we're trying to do, and our beliefs and our desires. And we do things because of our beliefs and desires. We initiate actions because of we desire some end, or we believe some end that we desire will be achievable by a certain route. And therefore, one of the forces at work in the world is humans with their intentions. So there are humans with mental lives, and that makes a difference to the physical world. And so what I called humanism, it's my name for it, is that the ultimates are very largely physical things, but as well as that, there are some mental things that make a bit of difference. And why I dismiss this fairly rapidly is because, well, it doesn't make a very great difference to the nature of the universe that there are some of us making it, perhaps animals, making a bit of difference to things. But the other view, of course, the final view you mentioned, is theism, the view that there is one God who is a personal being like ourselves and has thoughts that generate, and above all, intentions. He does things, and that being is God, and he is the cause or the permitting cause of everything that happens. Everything that happens in the physical universe and in our mental life is either caused by God or allowed to occur by God in giving us certain freedom of action. And that is the other alternative, the final alternative. And that's the difference between them. And I endorse the latter, the final one, theism.
Yeah, we were speaking just before we went live. You kind of worked with and spoke with and did bits and pieces with Derek Parfit, who's kind of almost like a sort of trying to ground moral realism outside and away from a god. And also, you've read and engaged with a whole plethora of atheistic philosophers. There is a subsection of atheistic philosophy which is really interested in that sort of materialism, and the idea that materialism is a simpler explanation to everything around us compared to a god. So I thought it'd be really interesting. I know that you've spoken to Oppie on a couple of occasions about this. That is Graham Oppie from Monash University. Really, really interesting philosopher. I think it'd be really helpful, Professor Swinburne, to ask you to steelman the sort of materialistic position, to explain it as clearly and coherently as possible. I'm aware that you're speaking, you're not writing, so it's never going to be as clear as it could be. But then to kind of then explain why it doesn't hold weight for you.
Well, the materialist position can be expressed in one or two different ways, but the most materialist of these ways is that the only substances of the world are physical things. They may be atoms or quarks or conglomerations of atoms, and we are such a conglomeration. And the only properties they have are size and shape and mass and charge and a few other things allowed by physics. And everything is really, that looks a bit different from that, is really reducible to it. And so we are really basically physical things, and we have a brain, which on the dualist view causes separate events separate from the physical, but on the physicalist view, all our thoughts and feelings and so on are just brain states and brain events. And that's all there is, the interaction of these things. Now, that, as I've stated it, seems an immensely complicated one in this respect, that it postulates an innumerable number, infinite no doubt, of substances in the world which, as it were, are independent entities. They all have very similar properties to each other, but there they are. Each one of them has the same property of attracting each other one with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, as in the law of gravity. And there they are, and they're the basic elements of things. And the complexity of that is, well, firstly, actually, each substance has got to have quite a number of separate properties. Its powers to interact with other substances in accordance with the law of gravity, in accordance with the strong force, the weak force, and electromagnetic force. And it's at this place rather than that place and so on. But the real complexity is that there are innumerable ones, and there isn't a single cause of them which holds them in being. They're just operative on their own. You may say, well, there's a single cause of them in that they're all caused by some primeval event, the Big Bang. But if you say that, then the Big Bang has to have built into it, as it were, all the separate properties of the individual things. And so it has to have built into it that there will be just those individual things, whether there are a finite or an infinite number of them, and they would have just those properties and be in just those places. And that seems to me a very complicated starting point for things. So that's what I've got against it. It is very complicated.
A thread I think we're going to come back to throughout this conversation is going to be kind of the mind and consciousness. So I think it'd be good to dive into that a little bit now. I want to kind of phrase the hard problem of consciousness for those watching or listening so that we can kind of dive further into your way of dealing with that. So the way that I like to go about it is speaking about a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who in 1974 wrote a very famous now paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And within this kind of paper, he explores the reality that conscious experiences are subjective and can only be known from someone's subjective or something subjective perspective. Another way to explore this, which I like quite a lot, is that you could have a colorblind scientist who knows all the facts that there are about the color red, but unless they're going to see the color red one day, they're only ever going to be limited to the facts. They're not going to have the subjective experience of redness that we would have if we were to look at a red tie or a sunset pink red color in the sky. There's something fundamentally different about these two things. And you kind of begin to explore the idea that at some point within evolutionary history, a soul came into existence and connected itself to a physical thing, an animal of some sort. So we kind of now have this sort of other substance. So we have the physical substance and we have the sort of mental or conscious substance. I'll let you kind of rephrase that however you want in a second. Would you mind, I guess, breaking down for us kind of what a soul is and kind of looking at the various criteria for a creature to be able to allow this thing to connect onto them?
Yes, but let's start a bit further back.
Sure.
What clearly came into existence, or barring Panpsychism, which you may want to refer to later, what came into existence at some period of evolutionary history is conscious beings, beings who were conscious. And that is that's a very, as it were, puzzling event in evolutionary history, because nobody has been able to explain on the basis of the properties of physical substances why that would have happened. But one can regard, and perhaps nearly, 40% of philosophers would agree nowadays, that there was this stage, but they would say that human thought, well, of any creature, thoughts and feelings and so on, are not states of a separate substance from the human being, but merely states of the human's brain. And so, as it were, my brain has physical properties, but it also has the properties of thinking and feeling and so on. These are different, and they are caused by, uh, on this view, by physical substances, by brain parts that are not conscious, and in turn, perhaps they affect other parts of the brain. And that view is known as property dualism. There are two sorts of properties, mental properties and physical properties, but only one sort of substance, one thing, a physical thing. And that is a halfway stage to the view which I hold, that and is known as substance dualism. That is to say that when we or any animal becomes conscious, what happens is that its brain causes the existence of a immaterial thing, a soul. It is the soul that has the thoughts and feelings and purposes, not the brain. But of course, it's in interaction with the brain. It's often caused to have the sensations by brain states, and in turn, when we do actions, it causes those actions. You use the phrase the soul comes into existence and then, or brings itself into existence and then causes brain states, but that's not my view. My view is that the brain causes the soul to come into existence, and it does so at somewhere or whenever the fetus becomes conscious, which I think is about the 6 months of pregnancy. And at that stage, At the first instant when the fetus has its first sensation, perhaps of pain or pleasure, it's a very simple sort of sensation, then there is a soul which has it. And that is my view of substance dualism. The word soul I'm using as just the name of that immaterial substance, which is the bearer of mental properties. And in that sense, I certainly hold that the higher animals, certainly not all the vertebrates necessarily, but at any rate the mammals, have consciousness and therefore have souls. But of course, their souls don't have the capacities that our souls have. Their souls are pretty simple sorts of souls, more complicated as we go further up the tree. But they can have sensations. Perhaps the primates can have beliefs, but they don't have complicated thoughts, let alone logical thoughts and moral beliefs. And I see no reason to suppose they have free will. So there are animal souls, but they're very different from very primitive forms of human souls, which have great capacities. Now, I agree that in popular discussion, the soul is used as a term for human particular separate substance. But that was not usual in thought. The medievals talked about animal souls as distinct from human souls, and they thought that, Aquinas thought, for example, the human soul was different in having free will and moral awareness, and that's the view that I endorse. And I think it's that comes into existence, at any rate, when the baby gets a bit older. And it's that makes us who we are. Well, I'm sorry, it's that is important for us, which makes us very different from the animals, and so perhaps worthy of keeping or suitable for a very different sort of life from them.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. It's fascinating, and please do correct me if I say anything wrong or rush past anything that's really important. I'm sure I'll muddle words up here and there. I guess the kind of way that I want to take this conversation now then is kind of this sort of idea of hard problem of consciousness, kind of how do we begin to explain these sorts of things. People like Philip Goff or Annika Harris or others have kind of said that science potentially isn't able to answer these sorts of questions. We need to turn to things like philosophy or even introspection to begin to try and understand what's going on within us. I know Josh Rasmussen has also written quite heavily in this space, some really interesting books there that I'll link in the description if anybody wants to go and explore that. But Professor Swinburne, my question to you is, are we kind of, by positing this hypothesis of a soul, I'm aware that we answer some fundamental questions and we give ourselves something to be able to take forward as well into things like the problem of evil. But are we actually kind of almost shifting the hard problem of consciousness into the hard problem of souls? Like, would it be possible for philosophers and scientists to test this hypothesis other than through arguments to the best explanation?
Well, I don't think they could test any scientific theory except by arguments to the best explanation. it's a great fallacy, which scientists adopt, that a scientific theory can only be rationally believed if when you've believed it, uh, there are certain predictions it makes, and you can test those predictions. I think the correct account of that, the criteria of scientific explanation, is that a scientific or any other um, theory about the world, then that if it's true, uh, its consequences are probably true. If it's false, its consequences are no, sorry, I expressed that badly. If it's true, it is probable that you would observe certain things, which you do observe. If it's false, it's not probable that you would observe the things that you do observe. And thirdly, it is simple. Now, it doesn't seem to matter to me whether the things you observe, which might make it true or false, are observed before you formulated the theory or after you formulated the theory. It seems absurd to suppose that there's this piece of evidence which has a certain relation to the theory, but whether it makes the theory more probable or not depends on when I thought about it. That can hardly affect the logical relation between the evidence and the theory. And in fact, the history of science bears that out. Newton's theory of gravitation, the most successful theory in the history of science, was formulated by Newton in the 1660s, but published by him in 1687. Um, um, it seems to make there were no new predictions which it made until 60 years later. But that didn't affect people seeing it was true. And why they saw it was true is because he explained how a lot of things which they knew and observed about and thought were sort of independent things, how were they connected to each other, all followed from his theory. Followed from his theory why you would get the tides that you do, why you would get the velocities of bodies moving down slopes that you do, why you would get the moon to go around the Earth in exactly the way it did, why you get the Earth to go around the Sun exactly the way it did, why you get the planets of Jupiter and Saturn to go. All of that was known beforehand. But Newton's great achievement and why everybody came to believe it true is not because he'd made a new, done a new experiment to show something, but because he had produced a theory that explained everything you got already. And that's why I think it's not a good objection to theism saying you can't. It doesn't make predictions. You've got the evidence already. It's there. The point is to assess what it shows. And a rather one example of this point is the average detective story, in which it's only in the last chapter that the detective reveals who did the crime. But in fact, you've been given all the clues in the earlier chapters. So everybody knew the clues, but the detectives saw how they fitted together, and that was the point.
I love that. That's fantastic. It would be great to, as you already mentioned, dive into panpsychism. Already mentioned Philip Goff, who kind of writes and believes in panpsychism. Annika Harris is kind of exploring this space quite nicely. And then I know that you've kind of followed the work of other philosophers of mind, such as David Chalmers, etc., who aren't panpsychists per se, but have at least kind of held the idea of panpsychism and then brought about objections to it. So there are loads of interesting philosophers who are exploring this space, is what I'm trying to get across with that. It's argued that kind of due to the fundamental nature of particles, which it is claimed, they are kind of have some sort of conscious property attached to it, and then as these particles are kind of aggregated into certain things, which we tend to think have to have brains. Like I wouldn't say my desk or this microphone is conscious, but if these particles were to come together within a dinosaur or within kind of my children, for instance, or myself, I begin to believe that consciousness comes about. So that's kind of panpsychism, like really, really watered down, that basically consciousness is fundamental within particles themselves. This obviously raises a whole host of kind of questions around the problem of evil, which I don't think we'll have time to get into. At least we will get into the problem of evil, but not through the lens of panpsychism. But a space that I want to explore with you now is to hear your thoughts on panpsychism as an even more fundamental kind of way of explaining why consciousness seems to come into the fore as we find creatures that are more and more capable of having brains that can hold more and more data and more processing power, etc.
Yes, but let's be clear about what panpsychism is. Its name suggests everything is psychic. Everything has a mental component as well as a physical component. But what is this mental component? If it is actual consciousness, then it is the claim that every atom is conscious in some way. But that is the strong form of panpsychism. And when one reads the panpsychists, it's not what they're saying. They're saying everything is proto-conscious, and proto-conscious seems to mean has the capacity, as you said, when uniting with certain other things, to give rise to consciousness. Well, in this latter form, I have no objection to it, because I too think that when atoms are put together in the form that forms a human brain, that gives rise to consciousness. Sure. But what looks startling about consciousness is the strong form that suggests that its atoms are really conscious. And that seems to me extrapolating from us and a few other animals being conscious to, on a wild degree, about everything, which is simply no evidence for. And it does raise the problem to which you adduced. If the atom is conscious, what's the difference when it's put together with other atoms to form my brain? And so the atom is, as it were, conscious in two ways. It's conscious itself, and it's part of what makes me conscious. And you can only express that difference if you say, well, there's a difference between my consciousness and its consciousness. And then the complexity begins to re-enter the picture. And I can't see, because the theory, if you accept the theory that atoms are really conscious, then it becomes more complicated in the sense that they have one form of consciousness, and when put together with something else, they have another form of consciousness. Then it needs an explanation of why only in certain ways of combination do they give rise to a second consciousness. I mean, why isn't my arm conscious? And why isn't my society conscious, my country? Why isn't the human race conscious? And they want to say it is sometimes, but it doesn't look that way. There seems all the difference in the world between me being conscious and the United Kingdom being conscious, because talk about the United Kingdom having views is just talk about the majority of people in the United Kingdom. So if you adopt the strong form, it leads to all sorts of complexity. If you adopt the weak form, it's not puzzling at all for me, uh, because it's just saying that in certain combinations, everything can lead to consciousness, and I accept that.
Really well said. Okay, so I want to move on to the problem of evil. I'm going to be doing this through the lens of kind of objections that I've seen raised online and within the literature to your work on the problem of evil. I think that will keep it to be quite an interesting conversation. So I'm going to give us a quote now from one of the books I held up earlier, Could a Good God Permit So Much Suffering, a Debate? And in that book you say, what I shall be claiming with respect to all the evils, whether horrendous or merely significant, which, if there is a God, he permits to occur, is that by doing so, God makes possible a comparable good, and it is not logically possible that God can provide that comparable good in any way which does not involve the occurrence of a similar evil. End quote. So, kind of a couple of things around that. I think when somebody reads or hears quotes such as that, and then they kind of think of sort of large scale, sort of kind of moral evils, say like the Holocaust in Nazi Germany or the death camps in Soviet Russia, there are sort of two things that kind of instantly spring to mind, which I would love to get your take on. So the first one is that it almost seems that the moral limits that have been bestowed on humans have been bestowed on them too broadly. So that's the sort of first area. And then the second area is the sort of gut reaction, which is almost that surely it's possible that the same amount of comparable good could have come about by reduction of evil, even if that reduction was, say, only 0.001%. There could be an amount that was reduced to enable a comparable good to come about. So they're the sort of two gut reactions, I guess, that I often see online on Twitter or in other various articles and publications. So, Professor Swinburne, what are your thoughts on those two areas?
Yes. Well, whenever anyone discusses with me this problem, I have the feeling that I sound very callous about the evils. There are some horrible evils in the world, and it's awful that they occur. I don't wish to deny that for one moment. The evils are usually classified into two sorts: moral evils and natural evils. Moral evils are those which are deliberately caused or through negligence allowed to occur by other humans. And the natural evils are those which are not in any way the responsibility of humans, such as diseases, famine, and so on. Okay, well, now your first objection uh, uh, is particularly relevant to the first kind. Um, let's just take one of these big evils. Um, to take the Holocaust is always a bit insensitive. So to those who have been affected by it. So let's take another one. I mean, what I say would apply there too, but I don't want to take it because detailed discussion of it can affect people rather badly. Let's take the slave trade. Now, this is indeed almost worse than any of the other evils because the slave trade, by which I mean the trading uh, West developed countries like Britain and France and so on, going to Africa, capturing large number of Africans, putting them in ships, sending them across the Atlantic to work as slaves. And the conditions in which they were captured, um, uh, lived on the ships, and subsequently lived were quite horrible. And what's particularly awful about this is it was done by people who were professedly Christians, unlike the other two evils you mentioned, which were done by people who are not professedly Christians. And that was an awful thing. Now, the objection is, surely God ought not to have given us so much power to any of us so that we could bring that about. Well, I think it's important to remember that the bad choices were not made just by the individual slave owners. They were made by people over a course of time who said that we are a superior race. These people we are trying to enslave don't feel anything. They are insensitive. It doesn't matter what they feel. We are the important people. And a whole culture grew up of being willing to neglect this suffering. Culture of people who indeed held offices in churches and condoned all this by turning a blind eye to what it involved. So there were a numerous number of people whose bad choices led to these very large scale effects. And all of these people I mentioned made bad choices, wrong choices, and knowingly, to some extent, wrong choices. Now, God could have made a world in which our choices had limited effects. But God, I think, entrusted us with great, as you suggested, great powers of choice. And it was enormously good for us that we have this, not merely because of the immediate effects, but because if we make a good choice, it becomes easier to make a good choice of that sort next time, and conversely with bad choices. And so, by our choices, we don't merely make a difference to other people. We make an enormous difference to ourselves. We have the power of making ourselves good people or bad people. And if God gives us big choices, he has the power, he gives us the power, not merely to make a big difference to others, but to make a big difference to ourselves. And so to make ourselves either saints or either unchangeably wicked. And that's an awesome gift, sure. But it is a great gift. And it's so good that such a good thing that we shall have this sort of power, that we shall have the power to make such differences, that I suggest it's worth the cost. And remember, all these sufferers also have choices, not choices they welcome, but they have choices. And the choices are how to deal with this, how to deal with the horrible suffering that they are having. And you can deal with it by being very bitter about those who are imposing the suffering on you, or by forcing yourself to say, being brought up this way, it's not altogether their fault. And the person who in the slave ship next to me is also suffering, and I must try and help him cope with his suffering. And so even in any, so often, and particularly in this case, when people are the victims of wicked actions, they too have choices, and their choices will make them saints if they make the right choices. It's not something they would choose, of course. And in the scale of eternity, and if you're talking about a religious view, you must look in the scale of eternity. The period of our life is a very short one, and we are preparing ourselves for a different life in the world to come. And God gives us a finite life, a short finite life, in which we can, if we choose, make ourselves good people and help other people to be happy or sad. And that's such a valuable choice that I think the cost is, or rather, if God is to give us this choice, he must permit, he doesn't bring it about that they suffer, he must permit that suffering. And I know it's horrible to say that, but consider the alternative. The alternative is where God doesn't allow us to make big choices, doesn't allow us to control our fate in any way, or rather only in a small way that doesn't make a real difference to things, either to the victims or to ourselves. And so the great gift which God gives is really a tiny gift that way, and he's reserved all the choices for himself. And in that situation, what's the point of a world at all in which there's a bit of which there's anything except a bit of suffering, a little bit of suffering, and what's the point of that at all? So I admit I am enormously impressed by what we can do with ourselves and what we can cope, but I think that's what makes us us, that we do have this power over ourselves as to how to deal with situations. And at this point, I always, since God cannot foreknow that we will abuse things quite in the way we do, I always like a quotation from scripture, which is not often quoted. It comes from the book of Genesis when the narrator is saying the world has reached a very bad stage, and therefore God has decided to bring about the flood. And that was followed by, according to Genesis, the flood, and only Noah and his family were saved. And what Genesis 6:6 says, as God is meditating on this, is God regretted that he had made the world. And I think that's true. That is to say, we let him down badly, but he gave us a great gift, and we let him down badly. So that is my answer. And my answer depends on our thinking that it's so good that we shall be able to make great differences to other people and great differences to ourselves. Such a good thing, rather than that we shall be programmed to live a comfortable life.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's so many more kind of questions I have in that vein, but I think it'd be good to kind of look at animal suffering before we bring it to a close. I don't want to neglect that either. I mean, there are kind of pictures that I've seen online of or various things in kind of states of pain. So there's one of a snake that's kind of caught in the aftermath of a forest fire who was trying to protect her eggs. Kind of almost looks like it's confused and kind of in pain, obviously, as it's dying. Or there's like kind of the skeletal remains of animals that maybe have fallen and got trapped between boulders, or some animals being mummified by the sun, and these sorts of obviously things that kind of are shown online to make you have that visceral, oh my goodness, this isn't okay reaction. So I guess the question that I'd like to understand is kind of why shouldn't pictures like this kind of solidify within the atheist mind that there can't be a good God? If there is a requirement for humans to have to go through certain things to require the right character to be able to enjoy the afterlife, obviously that enables other properties to occur within the world which are causing pain to creatures of certain degrees. Depending, you can make them chimpanzees if you want to make them as near to us as possible. They're experiencing these things. Kind of, how do we begin to not allow that sort of thing to make us question the goodness of God?
Yes, because obviously a lot of animal suffering occurred before there were ever humans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some animal suffering is certainly caused by humans, but there was a lot of it before there were humans. Yes. And the issue then turns on which kind of animals do suffer and how much do they suffer? Because after all, if you take the tree of animal life, as it were, starting with some very primitive single-celled organisms and working up to the great apes, um, nobody thinks these primitive organisms suffer at all, and they think the great apes suffer very much. So the question is where the suffering begins, and when it does begin, how much suffering is there? For intuitively, if we suffer a lot and primitive organisms don't suffer at all, as you go down the tree, there is less and less of it. So now nobody knows for certain just which animals do suffer, but I don't see any reason for supposing that animals below the level of mammals suffer. And the reason for that is that animals below that level don't have a prefrontal cortex, or at any rate, anything like it. And that when we suffer, it is because certain events occur in our, caused to occur by outside influence on parts of the prefrontal cortex. People often argue, as you were arguing, that snakes suffer, but the reason, and that fish suffer, but the reason for saying that is that fish and snakes have the behave by getting away from the cause of the suffering, and therefore, as it were, it seems to make some effect on them. But that is simply arguing from same effect to same cause, and that is not justified, because in human beings, when some event happens that damages our body, a nociceptor event, there are two different channels of new nerves from that event. One of them leads to the brain and to the prefrontal cortex, and causes us to feel things, but the other leads to our aversive behavior. If I put my hand on the hot plate by mistake, I feel something, and I also take it away. But there's one chain of that makes me take it away, and the other chain that makes me have a feeling. And you can have one of these neural chains operative and not the other one. There are people who don't feel pain. Their channel, the prefrontal cortex, isn't operative. And indeed, by various drugs, it can also be made inoperative. And there are, alas, with a certain drugs which will not make you show the pain, but you feel it all the same. The mere fact that the fish and the snakes show the behavior of trying to escape doesn't show that they feel anything at all. So it's only when an animal has a brain somewhat like ours that we have reason to suppose it feels things. But the mammals do have brains somewhat like ours, and the primates and one or two other creatures, such as elephants, um, um, do have brains somewhat like ours, in that they do seem to have, or the primates seem to have, um, uh, brains of the sort that would allow them to feel when they are caused pain. But the question then is how much pain they feel. And it's very difficult to know that, but by analogy, if we feel a lot and the lowest mammals feel virtually nothing, one wouldn't expect them to feel too much. And if you take the brain of our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, its prefrontal cortex is only a third of the size of ours, and that suggests that perhaps it only feels pain a third as much. Now, that's not to deny they feel pain, but there is good in pain of certain sorts, other than that it gives us opportunity to use our free will in certain ways. For the most impressive example of that is where um, um, animals, mother animals, not freely because they don't have free will, but instinctively, when their offspring are in danger, try to divert the predator from catching their offspring by offering themselves as victims. And that, it seems to me, is a good for the mother. Not as good as for the mother as if the mother had chosen to do that, but a good all the same. And that applies generally to humans. There is this further good. It's always a good for us if our lives, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, are of use to others. It's a good for me if my suffering is the cause of some well-being for others, even if I don't choose to suffer. An obvious example of that, when somebody's badly injured, say in a railway accident, which or indeed killed in a railway accident, when this leads to an improvement in the system of signalling that was responsible for that, so that it doesn't happen again. And when that happens, what the relatives always say is, it was terrible, he died or was injured in this way, but at any rate his death wasn't in vain because it led to all this. So it's always a good for me if my suffering, is the cause of some good, even if I don't choose that it is. Now, given that point, then the suffering of the higher animals is, I think, always a means of good to other animals, even if it's not chosen. Not nearly as good as if it was chosen, but a good all the same. And that would be my answer to the problem of animal suffering.
Well, Professor Swinburne, obviously there is so much work the listener, the viewer can go and explore of yours following this conversation. Thank you so much for answering these questions, for spending time with me today on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. But I would just like to add just one remark about my last remarks. These are my conclusion about animal suffering is very tentative. I may be mistaken about this, about how much they suffer. And if so, then this defense wouldn't work. I don't think I am mistaken, but I may be. And it's possible, just possible, that further work might show this, rather neuroscientific work might show this. I don't think it will, because animals can't talk, and the neuroscience is going to be pretty speculative, but it's possible. And if it's shown, then I would have to climb down on that one. I don't wish to seem dogmatic about it.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, just a very, very brief follow-up on that one then. So if it was found in, say, 5 years' time that kind of obviously animals experience pain due to a more kind of prior evolved evolutionary brain state, so the brain stem or something like that, of a sort of lower functioning brain part, would that make you question God himself, or just kind of your stance on animal suffering? Then you'd have to rebuild a case.
What would show what I'm concerned with is at this point is the degree to which animals suffer. If it were shown that they suffer as much as we do when they are stabbed, for example, that would make me worried. No, there are other ways out of this, and they have been explored sometimes. Some Christians have held, on the basis of certain remarks of St. Paul, that the redemption of the world by Christ doesn't only affect humans, it affects all nature and so on. Some have held that animals, or anyway, some animals, may well have an afterlife in which there can be adequate compensation for this. Or it may be that animals have rather more free will than we give them credit for. There are other possible avenues, but I don't feel the need to take these, and these are rather speculative avenues.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, Professor Swinburne, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. As we said right at the start, there are 2 books people can go and get straight away that are work on the popular level to explore these spaces further. Obviously, there's so much more they can go away and read on, especially this sort of later section on the problem of animal suffering, which is a big space at the moment within philosophy. But thank you so much for your time today, Professor Swinburne. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.